Hope you're doing well. We've been working our way through 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We're going to continue on in that study. We're picking up now on the next verse, verse 7. And what we've talked about so far is just how love is the center point of all Christian virtue. That without love, all the things that would otherwise seem virtuous, like knowledge or faith, or even works of philanthropy or any sort of external activity, if it's devoid of love, it's actually an empty thing. And then Paul describes what love does, that love is patient and that it's kind and a host of different things in verses 4 and 5 and 6. And now we come to a new one where Paul sort of describes what love is, or the ways that it functions. And the first thing that Paul says is that love bears all things. This is an incredibly important verse. You've probably heard this verse a number of different times, but love bears all things is the statement that Paul makes. Now, the word bear is really an interesting word here. It means to stand. It means to hold up under lots of pressure. It's the word stego in Greek, and it's a really interesting word. It just means the ability to stand under pressure, and that's really what he's talking about. What's fascinating about this word is that Paul uses it in the Corinthian letters twice positively. He talks about enduring all things. He says, I endure all things for the sake of the elect in 1 Corinthians 9:12. And then here he says, love endures or bears all things. And then he uses it twice negatively in the epistle to the Thessalonians. And what he says is that when I could no longer bear it, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I finally sought out to know whether you had remained faithful to Christ. His soul couldn't bear the thought of them not remaining faithful. And so he reaches out to them to find out what's happened to them, whether or not they've been faithful to the gospel that he taught them. And so Paul uses the word both negatively and positively. And here we have it used positively. He says love bears all things, it endures, it stands up under all things. And as I've told you, we've been working through these sort of pictures of love by considering what it looks like to love ourselves and then what it would look like to love others. And so what we want to do is sort of do the same thing here. What does it look like for a person who's loving themselves according to this command or this description of love? Well, a person who loves themselves is sort of unwilling to stand other people. In fact, we hear this all the time. I just can't stand him. And that's actually the exact same expression. That's what's being said there. And so a person who's in this way, who feels this way, they're going to be condemnatory. They're going to be rejecting of other people. They're going to be impatient for change. They're going to be quick to anger when there are offenses or weaknesses that the other person exhibits. And so that type of a person, they're rapid to move toward annoyance. They're quick to just say, I refuse to stand this anymore. I just can't take this anymore. That's the kind of heart that loves itself. Obviously, they might expect other people to put up with their weaknesses and failures, but they're not going to be willing to offer that same sort of patience and endurance when it comes to the other person. And as you can see, this sort of flows down in from all the other things that we've already talked about. Love is patient, it's kind, all those things. It's not irritated. But what Paul does here is he takes all of it and he brings it down and he says, love bears what? He says, love bears all things. There's never a point with love when we can say, I just can't stand it anymore. In fact, that phrase, I can't stand them anymore, I've had enough, I've had it up to here, all those expressions are actually expressions not of love, but of selfishness. Isn't that interesting? And then so then what would it look like to actually love a person this way? What does it look like to stand all things in that sense? Well, what it looks like is always being willing to put up with everything. That's really an amazing statement, to be willing to put up with everything that is thrown at it, and a willingness to just say, well, in this case, I need to stand up. I need to bear up under this annoyance or this pressure. That's what it looks like to truly love another person. Whether that's an inconvenience or a weakness of the other person, or even offenses or sins that have been committed against us, those can be quickly just set aside by a heart that loves, because that person has in their heart a desire to show that love to that person. Right? They understand that there's a higher goal, and so they're willing to set those things aside for the sake of that better thing. Love just remains steadfast and friendly in the face of difficulties and hardships. That's what it looks like to stand all things. And that's what Paul is calling us to do as Christians. He says believers should love, and that the way that they love, or what love looks like, is that it's willing to bear up under all those things. And so when we look at love, in this case, what we see is that God's heart for us stands all things, doesn't it? When we sin, God says, I love you as my child. I will stand all sorts of sins. I will forgive you for all of your transgressions and weaknesses. And the same ought to be true of us. We ought to love in this way. Now, this is good for just checking your own heart. We can say we love a person, but are we willing to stand them and stand all things from them? Or are there times when we say, I just can't stand this person anymore. I can't stand this. I can't stand that. I just can't stand how you are. I can't stand the way that you are. Those things are just love of self. But if we love that person, we say, you know what? I can stand you. I can bear all things. I can endure all things, not necessarily for my sake, but for your sake, because I love you and I want to see you moved more and more into the image of Christ. Well, that's what it means to bear all things. I hope that's both encouraging and convicting. And I do hope that you remember that God has this heart for us. And that's such an important thing. In moments when we find ourselves not being able to stand another person, God is still standing us. He's still offering us forgiveness. He's enduring with us and maintaining our justification so that we can then offer that same love and care for others who might not treat us the way that we expect that we ought to be treated. I hope that's helpful. Thanks for watching.